You people usually clean the rooms, not try to book them, the front desk clerk said with a smile that never reached her eyes. Professor Langston Wright stood frozen for a second, not because of the Colorado winter biting through his wool coat, but because the racism had arrived before the room key did. Langston hadn't intended to test his patience today. He had flown in from New Haven, exhausted after grading 87 final essays and delivering his last lecture of the semester at Yale. All he wanted was a quiet retreat, 3 days of snowy isolation at Glacier Creek Resort to finish editing the final chapters of his new book on Black excellence in post-war America. Irony was not in short supply. He placed his reservation confirmation on the counter. "My room should be ready." "Right." Langston Wright. The front desk clerk, a young blonde with a name tag that read Chloe, glanced at the screen and immediately tilted her head with mock confusion. "I don't see you right here. Are you sure you booked at this resort?" Langston's fingers twitched slightly on the polished countertop. "Yes, I booked weeks ago. Paid in full." Chloe tapped her keyboard a few more times. Then, leaning closer, she whispered, "Sir, we've had a few complaints about people trying to make fake reservations under other guest names. Are you sure this isn't one of those situations?" Langston's breath hitched. He could feel his heart pounding, but he had lived too long, taught too many, survived too much to let his voice tremble. "Would you please get your manager?" The word manager seemed to register as both a threat and an inconvenience. Chloe pursed her lips and walked away in her high-heeled entitlement. Langston looked around the opulent lobby-antler chandeliers, stone fireplaces, and portraits of white mountaineers gripping ice picks in triumph. His reflection stared back at him from the window. Gray-flecked beard, tailored coat, a man who had spent his life climbing peaks they never expected him to approach. He wasn't dressed like a tourist. He was dressed like legacy. The manager arrived 5 minutes later. A broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a forced politeness and a clipboard. "Dr. Wright," he said slowly, not quite believing it. "There seems to be a mix-up. Unfortunately, we're completely booked for the weekend. There must have been a cancellation error." "I paid," Langston said. "I have confirmation. I called 3 days ago to reconfirm. You said everything was in order." The manager smiled as though that meant nothing. "We'd be happy to recommend a few other local places. There's a budget in about 25 minutes down the mountain." Langston let out a dry laugh. "Let me guess. No Wi-Fi, no fireplace, and no white guests." The manager didn't respond. He didn't have to. Langston left without another word. He didn't make a scene. He didn't post a video. He didn't call a lawyer. Instead, he made a call. By the time Langston reached Denver the next morning, the snow had started to fall in thick, slow-motion flakes. He checked into a downtown suite and poured himself a cup of hotel coffee. Then, in the quiet warmth of the room, he opened his laptop and joined a Zoom call with 3 people who had more than enough money and more than enough reasons to make things happen quickly. "Lang," said Sarah Kim, venture capitalist and daughter of Korean immigrants, "are you seriously thinking of buying a ski resort?" "I'm thinking of buying a chain of them," he replied. Next to her, Anthony Delgado, a tech entrepreneur who once dropped out of MIT and built an empire with an app that let people anonymously rate professors, smirked. "For revenge? Because if it's for revenge, I'm in." Langston leaned back. "Not revenge. Legacy. Visibility. Symbolism. And yes, a bit of poetic justice." The third figure on the call, Nadine Shun, former real estate attorney turned luxury hospitality investor, tapped her fingers together. Langston, Glacier Creek, is part of the Mountain Strong Group. They're independently owned, but every property is leveraged up to its icicle-covered neck. With the right pitch and the right number, we can have a controlling interest in under a week. Langston smiled for the first time in 24 hours. "Then let's get to work." 4 days later, Langston returned to Glacier Creek. Not as a guest, not as a professor, not even as a customer. He stepped out of the black SUV wearing a black wool coat and leather gloves. The same front desk clerk, Chloe, was still behind the counter, chewing gum and scrolling through her phone. She looked U-panned, paled instantly. Langston didn't stop at the counter this time. He walked directly into the manager's office. The manager stood as if someone had fired a gun into the ceiling. Dr. Raituai, mean professor, sir. Langston placed a folder on the desk. Effective immediately, I own 70% of this property. You'll find the transfer documents and the new leadership chart inside. The manager stared at him as though the mountains outside had just collapsed. I'll be bringing in a new general manager next week, Langston continued. And we're beginning renovations to expand access for underrepresented guests. Also, we're removing the photos of Confederate soldiers from the bar lounge. That's not heritage. That's intimidation. The manager didn't speak. Langston turned to leave, then paused. Ohan Chloe is no longer employed. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was a brilliant blue. Guests passed by in thick scarves, unaware that the power dynamics of their vacation had just shifted beneath their feet. Langston stood on the balcony of the top suite that night, watching the slope lights glow against the darkness. His phone buzzed. A message from one of his students saw the news. "You're a legend." He didn't reply. He just watched the wind move the pine trees, feeling for the first time in a long time that history wasn't just something he wrote about. It was something he could own. Langston's name was on every document, but he had no intention of running a ski resort alone. This wasn't about micromanaging linen orders or planning wine tastings. This was about rewriting narratives quietly, forcefully, and permanently. On the fifth day, the board of Mountain Strong Resorts held an emergency meeting via satellite call. Only 2 members had voted against the acquisition, and they were now watching their stock values rise by the hour. "Professor Wright," said a skeptical, balding man in a tie too expensive for his manners, "you've never worked in hospitality. What makes you qualified to oversee a portfolio of resorts?" Langston looked him directly in the eye. "I've spent my entire life navigating rooms where I wasn't wanted, leading institutions that weren't built for me, and mentoring minds that will outlast every resort on this continent. What makes you qualified to ask that question?" The silence was golden. He continued, "This is not just business. It's justice. These properties will no longer be monuments to exclusion." From that day forward, the name Mountain Strong began to shift slowly at first, then with undeniable speed. Langston brought in a new leadership team. He didn't fill it with just black professionals, though. He made sure many were included. He reached out to indigenous architects to reimagine the resort aesthetics. He hired disabled veterans to consult on slope accessibility. He replaced imported decor with artwork by local students from underserved schools. He changed the texture of the space. But none of it happened without backlash. The death threats came first sloppy, angry emails filled with spelling errors and the stench of panic. Then came the op-eds. "Woke tyranny hits the mountains. Academia invades Colorado's heritage. Do black people even ski?" Langston read them all. Some he laughed at. Others he forwarded to the legal team. But the one that got under his skin came from a former guest named Curtis Fenwick. Curtis had been coming to Glacier Creek for 15 years. He was white, mid-40s, a banker from Dallas who owned a vacation home 10 minutes away. In a video uploaded to his followers, he stood outside the resort, red-faced and furious. This used to be a place where people could escape politics. Now it's all about diversity, inclusion. Quote is what happened to just skiing with your kids and not being lectured. Langston replayed the video 5 times. He didn't reply publicly. Instead, he made a phone call to the resort's media consultant. "I want to shoot something. Short. Direct. Just me. 2 days later, a 1-minute video dropped on the official Glacier Creek site. Langston stood in front of a snow-covered slope, dressed plainly in a sweater and coat. No filters, no makeup. "I didn't buy this resort to erase anyone's memories," he began. "I bought it so new ones could be made." He paused. "If skiing with your kids is all you want, we welcome you. If you're here to escape politics, maybe it's time to ask why inclusion feels political to you." That video went viral, not because it was angry, but because it was unshakably calm. Because it came from a man who had endured exclusion with grace and now offered something better in return. And yet, Langston was tired. Behind every strategic move, every bold announcement, was a deep fatigue he had carried for decades. The kind of fatigue that comes from always being the first, the only, the example. He stayed in Colorado for 3 weeks. Not in the penthouse suite, but in one of the regular rooms, room 204, with a view of the parking lot and a sliver of the trees. He woke early. He walked the grounds. He ate breakfast alone and listened. He watched who was served first, who was smiled at, who wasn't. And then, on the morning of the 15th day, something unexpected happened. An envelope slid under his door. It was handwritten. Inside, a folded letter and a photo. "Dear Dr. Wright, my name is Maya Callahan. I'm 12 years old. My mom says I'm too young to write business letters, but I think business people need to hear from kids too. We came here last year, and someone told my mom this resort wasn't for people like us. I didn't understand what that meant until I saw her cry in the car. This year, we came back, and everything was different. The front desk lady knew my name. The ski instructor was a black lady named Serena who said I could be an Olympian if I practiced. And guess what? The hot cocoa was free. I don't know what you did, but thank you. This is now my favorite place in the whole world." Attached was a picture of Maya in a bright pink snowsuit, her arms flung wide on the beginner slope, snow flying around her boots. Langston sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. He didn't cry, but something in his chest loosened. That night, he walked out onto the same balcony where he had stood the week before. The wind had changed direction. Down below, the resort glowed with firelight, laughter echoing from the dining hall. He remembered his father, how he used to say, "Change doesn't come by banging on the gates. Sometimes it comes by buying the land around them." Langston didn't want to own land forever. He wanted to grow something on it. A week later, he flew back to New Haven. Campus was quiet. The winter term hadn't started yet, and the dorms were mostly dark. His office, however, was full, books stacked high, papers waiting, a message on his desk from a journalist who wanted to write a profile on the professor who bought justice. He ignored it. Instead, he sat down at his desk and began typing the new first chapter of his book. He changed the title, from Black Resilience in White Spaces, to Owning the Summit, Quiet Power and a Legacy We Choose. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow, steady, silent. Inside, Professor Langston Wright wrote, "Not just to remember, but to reclaim." Langston returned to teaching that semester with something new in his voice. His students noticed. There was still the precision, the biting intellect, the elegant sarcasm, but now there was weight, a lived authority. On the first day of race, power, and cultural memory, he walked into the lecture hall, dropped his satchel by the podium, and faced 60 students in silence. Then he spoke. "What would you do," he asked, "if the world handed you humiliation wrapped in politeness?" No one answered. He smiled. "I'd suggest, by the wrapping paper company." Laughter broke the tension, but the message lingered. The story of Glacier Creek had made its rounds across the country, not in the tabloids, but in the minds of thinkers. Quietly, it had become case study material in MBA programs, diversity seminars, even real estate forums. Langston didn't boast about it. He let the results speak. Over the next 3 months, 3 more resorts under Mountain Strong's banner came under review. He traveled Ogden to Montana, Vermont, and Oregon, meeting with each property's leadership, local staff, and guests. The Vermont resort, high in the Green Mountains, had a deeply problematic history. Old promotional materials showed staff in colonial uniforms, and there were annual events called Heritage Weekends that excluded anyone who didn't look like descendants of the Mayflower. Langston met with their board in a room paneled in cherry wood, beneath a giant painting of a white family on a sleigh. "You know," he said calmly, "snow doesn't care what color you are. Why should skiing?" By spring, the Vermont resort had renamed the event to Mountain Unity Week, partnered with local schools, and begun a scholarship program for Indigenous and first-generation skiers. But it wasn't all smooth. Some staff quit. Some longtime guests took their business elsewhere. Anonymous online reviews bombed their ratings, calling the chain too political, ruined by woke culture, anti-American. One morning, Langston woke to an image emailed to his private account. It was a Photoshop picture of his face on a target, with the words, "You will not replace us," in block letters. He closed the email and forwarded it to the FBI. Then he turned off his phone. He spent that weekend alone, walking along the Quinnipiac River with a scarf over his mouth and headphones in his ears, listening to Coltrane. He thought of the names carved into history's bark, those who had been beaten back and those who had refused to move. There was no rest in what he was doing, but there was clarity. In April, he returned to Glacier Creek for a quiet visit. The air was warmer, the slopes wet with melting ice, the scent of pine stronger than ever. He walked into the main lodge wearing jeans and a hoodie unrecognizable to most. At the front desk, a young black man looked up and grinned. "Professor Wright, welcome back." Langston paused. "You know who I am?" "I do, sir. I applied to work here after I saw what you did. Figured it was about time someone who looked like me could hand out keys and not just carry bags." Langston smiled and shook his hand. "Glad to hear it, Mr. Darnell, sir. Darnell Brooks. Call me Langston." Upstairs in the newly renamed Ida B. Wells Lounge, Langston sat with an old friend, Professor Evelyn Sanders, a civil rights historian who had once mentored him in grad school. "I heard about what you did out here," she said, sipping hot cider. "Buying property to reclaim narrativethats, a bold tactic." "It's exhausting," he admitted. "But effective," she added. "We don't always get to burn things down. Sometimes we just have to own them." They talked until midnight about legacy, memory, violence, and healing. At one point, Evelyn pulled a small box from her bag. "I brought you something," she said, handing it over. Inside was an antique brass key. "It's symbolic," she explained. "From the first black-owned hotel in Chicago, circa 1890s, burned down by mobs a few years later." Langston held it in his palm for a long time. The weight felt spiritual. "We've always been building," she whispered, "even while they tried to bury us." He nodded and understood. Summer came, and with it, another round of transformation. Langston launched the Summit Initiativia Scholarship Fund for youth of color to learn mountain sports, leadership, and hospitality training. The first cohort arrived in June. 30 teenagers from across the U.S., buzzing with energy and nerves. Langston greeted them in person. A girl from South Central L.A. raised her hand during the orientation and asked, "Sir, why mountains? Why not do this in the city?" Langston chuckled. "Because mountains have long been places of escape for the privileged. It's time we reclaim the peaks, too." He stayed on-site with them for 2 weeks, teaching workshops, listening to their stories, watching their confidence bloom. One night, a young boy from Baltimore named Malik knocked on his door. "Professor Wright," he said shyly, "can I ask you something personal?" Langston nodded. "My dad always says people like us don't belong in places like this. I'm trying to prove him wrong, but sometimes I believe him." Langston leaned forward. When I was your age, he said, I believe that too. Not because it was true, but because nobody around me was trying to prove it false. That's why you're here, to see it with your own eyes. Malik looked down. Do you think I could ever run a resort like this one day? Langston placed a hand on his shoulder. I expect you to. In July, tragedy struck. The Oregon Resort Crimson Pines experienced an arson attack. No lives were lost, but the main lodge was gutted. The note left behind read, Go back to where you belong. This is white land. Langston flew out the next morning. He stood in the ashes with firefighters and journalists swarming around. Cameras in his face. Microphones pushing for anger. But Langston didn't yell. He didn't cry. He simply said, We will rebuild. Donations flooded in. Support poured out. Hate had tried to burn something down. Instead, it lit a torch that more people now chose to carry. Langston's 67th birthday arrived quietly. He spent it not at the resort, not at Yale, but in Atlanta visiting the grave of his mother. He brought flowers, Magnolia, her favorite. As he sat beside her, he spoke softly. Mama, they try to turn me away from a place because of my skin, but I turned that place into a door for others. The wind whispered through the trees. He stayed for hours, and when he stood up, he felt lighter. Not finished, but rooted. The following winter, the Glacier Creek Resort welcomed its busiest season in history. But it wasn't just about numbers. Something deeper had changed. The staff now reflected the world outside, the mountain's black ski instructors, Latino chefs, indigenous guides explaining the land's sacred roots. A new wing of the lodge had been built, dedicated to journeys unseen, a small museum Langston funded himself, chronicling the history of marginalized peoples in the American outdoors. Photos of black mountaineers, Chinese railroad workers, Navajo shepherds' faces that had been left out of the alpine, mythos greeted guests before they reached the elevators. And people noticed. Guests came from all over the country not for activism, but for belonging. Families who had never considered a ski trip before now saw themselves on the brochures. Black mothers watched their children fly down powdery slopes, not with fear, but with pride. Elderly veterans sat beside queer couples at the fire pit. No one looked away. The mountain had not changed, but what it meant had. And Langston? He observed it all quietly from the back of the dining hall, sipping his tea, taking notes. He was always taking notes, until one day, someone interrupted him. It was Chloe. Yes, that Chloe. She had requested a meeting through HR, asking to speak to Mr. Wright, if he's willing. Langston had said yes. Now, she stood in front of him, awkward in her thrifted coat, looking older than he remembered. I'm not here for my job back, she said quickly. I didn't assume you were, he replied gently. I just wanted to say I am sorry, she continued. I said things to you that day. I was ignorant. I didn't see you. Not really. I was scared of losing something I didn't even own. Langston didn't interrupt. I've learned a lot since then, she said. About myself. About this place. About how I used to hide my hate behind policies. But it was hate. And I see that now. Langston took a long breath. You don't owe me anything, he said finally, but I hope you find ways to build something better out of what you've learned. She nodded, eyes full of tears, and left quietly. He watched her gone with judgment, but with a quiet gratitude for the unexpected. Some changes are quiet revolutions. Spring returned to the mountains. Langston knew he couldn't run this forever. That had never been his goal. He was a teacher before he was a mogul, and his heart remained in classrooms, not conference rooms. So, in a televised address streamed across the Mountain Strong network, he made an announcement. As of this season's end, I'll be stepping down as chairman of the board. In my place, I'm naming a new CO, Serena Jackson. Serena, The black ski instructor from the youth program stood beside him. Former Olympic bronze medalist, wilderness educator, raised by a single mom in Detroit. She beamed, tears rolling freely down her cheeks. "She knows these mountains," Langston said. "But more importantly, she knows what it means to rise from the base." The applause from the audience was thunderous. Later, in private, Serena asked him, "Are you really ready to let it go?" Langston smiled. "I'm not letting it go. I'm letting it grow." And with that, the torch passed. Months later, Langston stood at the opening of a new resort in Taos, New Mexico. The first one built entirely under the new ownership, on land jointly managed with the Taos Pueblo. He didn't cut the ribbon. That honor went to Maya Callahan, the 12-year-old girl who had once written him the letter. She was now 13, braces on her teeth, fearless in her stance. Before she cut the ribbon, she said to the crowd, "I used to think the mountains weren't mine, but now I know they were just waiting." Langston closed his eyes. Let the words sink into him like warmth through frost. He had never been after glory, only reclamation. On the evening of his final day as a public steward of the Mountain Strong chain, Langston sat alone again, this time in a simple lodge chair overlooking the horizon. He had a notebook open on his lap. The wind swept soft across the deck. Below, children laughed in the snow. Behind him, inside the lobby, a jazz trio played Ellington. He wrote slowly, "We were never supposed to make it here. That's what the world whispered. That we were too loud, too dark, too much. That the mountains were too high, the doors too closed. But here we are. We have learned to walk into rooms and rewrite the story. We do not knock. We build. And one day, someone will stand where we stood, not in anger, but in inheritance." He paused, looked up. The sun was setting. The sky caught fire with gold. A voice called behind him, "Langston, they're waiting for you downstairs." He closed the notebook, tucked it into his coat, and stood tall, letting the air wrap around him like a final blessing. He walked inside not as the man they turn away, but as the man who built the door and left it open. Forever. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.